And so that's where we find ourselves today at the conclusion of that. Daniel is a man that at this stage of his life is in his mid to late 80s most likely, and we've really covered a lot of material in a fairly short amount of time in terms of one man's life. We had to have a couple of different gaps of 20, 30 years or more to get us through that, but we've gone through the story that tells us. We pick up with Daniel as about a 15-year-old boy who was taken from his homeland. Okay, so just again, try to imagine. And this is one of the things I want you to pick up on is that God's purposes move on even when nations come and go. All right? And as much as we, as patriotic Americans, want to see America in the form that in most cases, we remember America in a way that we currently now don't see it. And we want to see it get back to a level of prominence and a level of high standards that we used to believe, and rightfully so, we're convinced that it represented us, and we were in many ways proud to be an American for seemingly all the right reasons. Now we're not naive enough to look the other way and ignore what we know to be true about our nation. When it's wrong, it's wrong. And in some cases, we are way wrong. But the fact of the matter is, God's purposes with God's people has always marched forward regardless of the condition of the nations. Nations have come and nations have gone. And I don't wish or desire for that to be the story of America. I don't wish for America to pass from the scene. But we do know that all great civilizations have run their course over time. And we know that as we approach 250 years as a nation, we know that we're pushing the limits of how long a great civilization or a great nation has ever existed and prospered. And this message is not designed to take us down the road of discussing all nations or specifically our own, but I want you to see, as I have reiterated more than once throughout these series of lessons and studies through the book of Daniel, God is the featured hero of the story, okay? Daniel is impressive. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have set a wonderful tone in their behaviors, and they have shown us what Christian character looks like on display even in hostile environments. They are wonderful examples for us. In fact, we'll conclude today with another reminder of the type of character that we should put on display as followers of Jesus Christ, even if our nation is not led by leaders who do the same thing. But the fact is, there is great potential in a godly life. There is great potential in a godly life. Not potential specific to that person, that they will be fulfilled or that they will have a great life that everybody remembers. That's a byproduct. But the potential for a godly life, or the potential good that can come out of a godly life, is what we see in Daniel, is that God ends up with the glory. God ends up being honored and recognized. And we'll see that as we continue on today. The godly life that Daniel has led will continue right into his upper 80s. He will continue in this story to influence other people in the direction of godly living. And what else better could ever be said about your life when it ends than for someone to be able to say, that person influenced me in a direction of godly living? That is the potential of a godly life. Daniel couldn't save or redeem the lost kings that he worked for. He couldn't do that himself, but he could live a life that influenced them in the direction that could possibly bring them to faith in the one true God. We saw that at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life. By all indications, the testimony of King Nebuchadnezzar, after a long life of being ruler over a massive empire, which included a lot of things that were ungodly in his behavior, by the end of his life, God had humbled him using circumstances, and God had influenced him using people like Daniel. And by the time it was all said and done, the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar's life was, there is one true God. He's different. He's the best. He's the one who's worthy of our worship. And we're going to see that again, Daniel has that type of influence even late in life upon another king that comes along. And so the story goes that Daniel was born and raised in Israel. The nation of Israel had been torn in half. They had a northern kingdom which kept the name Israel and a southern kingdom which went by the name Judah. Daniel was in Judah. The people of Judah had fallen away from God, and eventually God allowed them to be conquered by a young man named Nebuchadnezzar who was building an empire in Babylonia. Daniel and several others in particular were recognized for being impressive young men that were smart, that would be good leaders. And so they took them, these Jewish boys, they took them to Babylonia. They trained them in the way of the Babylonians so that when the rest of the Jews were going to be gathered up and moved into this new kingdom, Daniel would be a good, strong influence over his own people. Well, he was more than that, as chapter 1 showed us. Chapter 2 then showed us that God had blessed him with the ability to interpret dreams, which came in real handy for Nebuchadnezzar, who God shook with an incredible dream. Daniel was able to tell him and interpret the dream. It warned him about the future. He didn't listen to the warning in a lot of cases, so he went right on being a pagan king into chapter 3. He even tried to take Daniel's buddies and have them thrown in the fiery furnace because they wouldn't bow down and worship. Nebuchadnezzar had decided he wanted to be a god. That was a common thing back then. Later on, God has a moment with Nebuchadnezzar late in life where he rocks his world again with a dream. Daniel tells him what's going to happen as a result of this dream, and it happens. He has to spend 7 years eating grass like a wild animal living outside. He wakes up from that when God snaps him back to, and he says, yeah, you really are God and I'm not. It's amazing how God can get your attention. And so that was an incredible story. Then later on, after he passed away, some other kings came along. The empire was starting to crumble. Weak leadership, ungodly leadership, people who had forgotten what they had been taught. Sound like any country you've ever heard of? Things that their empire had been built and blessed upon in the latter years of Nebuchadnezzar had fallen away in the 25 years afterwards. And so God lets them know that their time of their empire is over and they're not going to get a few years to work it out. He sends the handwriting on the wall. Daniel's the only one that can explain it. He's about 80 years old. And he says, tonight's the night, it's all over. And that's exactly how it happened. They were ambushed and overtaken basically without a fight by a new empire that was a combination of the Medes and the Persians had worked together and they became the new world power. Babylonia was done. The Babylonian Empire was over. Just as had been prophesied in Daniel chapter 2, there was a new empire taken over. It had a king, but it was also split between the Medes and the Persians, so it was never going to be quite as unified. as the previous one. And what you've got is Daniel started out as a Jewish boy in Judah, okay? Living for God, honoring God. He got picked up and moved to Babylonia. Now he is a Babylonian who honors God, lives for God, even in a pagan society that has no interest in God, that will even persecute people for not worshiping their chosen God from time to time. And then, before his life is over, Daniel becomes the citizen of another nation or another empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. Now Daniel is a citizen of their empire who lives for God and honors God. The purposes of God are unstoppable. He works through his people, whether they are a citizen of Judah, Babylonia, or the Medo-Persian Empire. If someone came and took control of the United States of America before all of us passed away, we would, if there was no United States of America, we still identify primarily and always as followers of Jesus Christ. Amen. If someone picked us up, rounded us up, and moved us away from our homeland, Daniel's example shows us that kingdoms come and kingdoms go. Earthly citizenship could come and go. Earthly leaders can be good, bad, indifferent, and all things in between. God's people live for his purpose regardless. Amen? And that's who we need to be. Daniel chapter 6. Go with me now. Again, as with most of this book, it is a narrative that tells a story verse after verse, so we don't have to stop and give long explanations. You can look forward to longer explanations next chapter when we get into the prophecies, all right? Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. So we had concluded chapter 5. The Babylonian Empire's done. The new king is being set up here. He's got control over this whole empire now. He decides it's smarter to divide it into 120 provinces. So we can imagine, let's imagine that somebody took the United States of America, and instead of being divided into 50 states, we divided it into 120 states. Okay? So that's the imagined scenario right here, which he did. Now, verse 2. This king, or the king, also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. So in each of the 120 provinces, they had a governor. So instead of having 50 governors, we'd have 120 governors. And instead of having one president over all 120 provinces, they set up 3 presidents, basically over 40 provinces each, right? And so that's the way they would set it up. So imagine a scenario where we have 120 states with 120 governors, and those 120 governors are overseen by a president, 3 different presidents, which divide the kingdom up evenly among themselves as far as responsibilities go. Now, verse 3 tells us that Daniel, even at his advanced age, soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire kingdom. So there was an obvious distinction between Daniel's capabilities and everybody else's capabilities. Daniel was one of the 3 presidents. He really outshone the other 2 presidents, plus anybody else underneath that might be aspiring to be a president someday. And it was so obvious that Daniel's leadership was so much better than anybody else's. His judgment and his discernment was so much more impressive that the king decided, look, I think I'll just make him the president over all 120 provinces. I'm just going to rework my setup here because Daniel seems so impressive. Now, I want you to note that when you live your life to honor God, you never know where God might choose to have you promoted. It's not a guarantee. We're going to see that Daniel being promoted turned out to not be a real positive thing, at least temporarily. So sometimes God will provide us with a promotion. He will put us in a position of higher authority, but that's no guarantee. It seems like that Daniel had already brokered a deal with this new king that allowed the Jews to start going back home to Judah. And under Ezra, they start working on the temple, and then eventually Nehemiah goes back and helps them rebuild the wall. So it appears that Daniel's influence with the king had allowed the Jews permission to leave this new empire and head back home and try to rebuild their homeland. So he'd already had the greatest foreign policy victory that anybody could imagine. Now verse 4. You know how it goes. The story changes, and you've heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den, so here we go. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs. But they could not find anything to criticize or condemn. So it's just a jealous plot that has no basis. Okay? The rest of verse 4 simply states, he, Daniel, was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. That's a pretty impressive resume right there. They, who even you would guess that politicians of that time were pretty skilled at finding some dirt on somebody. And they had to admit they got nothing on Daniel. They've got nothing to work with here. Everything about him just screams integrity, decency, positive behaviors that can't be twisted in any negative way. But that doesn't stop them. They don't look at that, throw up their hands and go, well, I guess we'll just have to let Daniel be number one. No, they don't give up that easily. Verse 5, we've got a sinister plot here. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. Ladies and gentlemen, followers of Jesus, that'd be a great thing for us to ever be plotted against by saying. That someone would look at us and say, the only thing I've got is that they're just too loyal to their God. The only thing we're ever going to be able to find against him or her is that they are just too devoted to their God. Now, we don't get any more details. They formulate a plan of some sort. And now here we go in verse 6. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius, because you always have to greet him appropriately. Whether you really mean it or not, you have to say that. And so they did. Here comes the sales pitch in verse 7. I want you to note that within the first line, they're lying. We are all in agreement. Pause. That's a lie. Daniel was one of the administrators, and he didn't agree. I'm guessing that Daniel didn't even know about it, but he certainly didn't agree. So immediately they lie, and they present the idea that there is consensus among all of us, right? Anything to try to help influence the king. So they tell him, hey, we're all in agreement here. Well, at least one wasn't in agreement, and in fact, the most prominent one wasn't in agreement. But their strategy works, as is often the case here in this broken and fallen world. People can lie, and it seems like they get away with the lie, right? It seems like they prosper and benefit from their deception. Sometimes we get frustrated when God doesn't intervene and stop every bad behavior. Well, He's God, and we're not, so we need to get over it. We are all in agreement, verse 7. We administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, everybody they could think of, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. See, their gods, lowercase g gods, they weren't special to them in any way. Their gods, they just hoped that their gods had some power in some certain aspect of life. But they didn't really necessarily think of their gods as being divine or any kind of, holy and separate. Their gods were just as poorly behaved as they were. So for them to take a human and treat him as God for 30 days, that was not blasphemous at all to them. That was no big deal. They could take any human, give him 30 days to be God, and they just thought that that would be a fun little revival exercise. So that's the strategy. King, we're all in agreement. We think that you ought to use your power to set up a law that says nobody can pray to anybody, a divine God or a human, either one. Nobody can pray to anybody but you for the next 30 days. You get to be God for 30 days. Well, it wouldn't be that big of a stretch for any of us to start thinking, hey, that sounds pretty good. Right? I mean, a little stroke of the ego, a little opportunity for everybody to acknowledge you. That scratches us right where we itch sometimes. We want to be acknowledged. We want to be noticed. We want to be lifted up. Certainly somebody in this position, why not, right? So here's this very simple plan, verses 8 and 9. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law. I think the guys already had it written out. All they were waiting for is his signature. Sign this law so it cannot be changed. An official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. That was one real key aspect of their civilization. Their empire was built on irrevocable laws, meaning laws that could not be amended or undone. They were very, very strict about any law they put in place. They didn't want kings just making random laws one day and then changing it back when the winds blew a different direction. So they were very fierce in their determination to set a law, and any law that was set had already been thought through, had already been processed, and there was no way that it could be undone. And the guys were banking on this. And so, verse 9 very simply says, King Darius signed the law. There really is no recourse for the king to undo the law, even though he was king. They granted the citizenship at large and the lower administrators underneath the king. Basically, it was a system of checks and balances, right? So that the king couldn't just issue executive orders that the people had to follow. It had to, anything that he passed that then became law couldn't be adjusted. That was their system of balancing out the power that the king would hold. Okay, so now verse 10 shows us the process. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. Effectively, Daniel heard about it, shrugged his shoulders, and went home and did what he always did. I think that's pretty neat. He just went home, knelt down the way he always did. The design of their homes meant that an upper room would be ventilated so that they could get air to pass through in that hot environment. And so this lattice work, if he didn't have the windows thrown completely open, at least had lattice work that would be ventilated so that it could receive air in. And where he knelt in the most prominent place that he had in the direction of the temple in Jerusalem, he'd been doing this undoubtedly for 70 years since he'd been there. But that meant that the other people could look in and see him. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't doing it in secret. He didn't think to himself, well, you know what, I better lay low here for 30 days and just do my praying and my worshiping in secret. No, he just continued doing what he did. He didn't make an open spectacle. He didn't announce, hey, look what I'm doing. He just faithfully worshiped the same way he had been. He wasn't looking to start a fight, but the king had passed a law that he could not abide by. And that's where we find ourselves occasionally as Christians. If we lived in other countries right now, we would already have to live in violation of some laws. There may come a day before we can turn around twice, where there are statutes and laws in America that we will have to violate in order to worship God. And we best be prepared to do just that. We must obey God rather than men. The instruction from Romans chapter 13 is to honor the governing authorities. But when those governing authorities get outside of their lane and they start trying to govern in a way that blocks our worship of God, then guess what? We don't honor their laws anymore. And that's simply what Daniel did, without any fanfare, without taking to the streets, without attempting to overthrow the government. He simply exerted his influence by continuing to be faithful, unashamed, and let whatever happens as a result happen. And that, brothers and sisters, is a lesson to you and me going forward. Look what Daniel did. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. He did not alter worship because of the new law that had been passed. And yet at the very same time, he did not intentionally or in some obvious way, he did not dishonor the governing authority. But he had to make a decision. The line had been crossed by the king's law. Therefore, the Christian is not afraid to take the punishment when they violate a law that violates our God. So verse 11, then the officials, obviously having set the trap for him, went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. This is the crime that they punished him for. Just take a quick glance at that again. This is the crime that he will be prosecuted for praying and asking for God's help. Isn't that something? You think you live in a land of oppression? No, you don't. No, you don't. So, verse 12, they went straight to the king and reminded him about the law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. It still hasn't dawned on him yet what this is going to mean, but it's about to. Verse 13, then they told the king, that man Daniel, and about that moment, I'm sure the king sunk down in his throne. He likes Daniel. Now, he doesn't worship Daniel's God, but he likes Daniel. He's impressed by Daniel. He knows the history of Daniel. He's already witnessed his testimony on display. He has already worked with him to let the Jews go back home. Undoubtedly, he knows that Daniel had prophesied all that stuff to the previous kings, so he likes him. He never intended for this to hurt Daniel. That man Daniel, oh, by the way, they throw a slur in here, one of the captives from Judah, which was a way of saying he's not one of us. That man Daniel, one of the captives of Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. We got him. Now, he's been doing this for 70 years. But now it's a problem. His rights and his freedoms are going to be infringed upon. Right? He thought he had the First Amendment right. Freedom of speech. Freedom of religion. Nope. Verse 14, hearing this, the king was deeply troubled. Some translations say the king was upset with himself. He was deeply troubled within. He knew that he had been duped into signing this law that was going to force the death of his own favorite administrator. His own ego had done this. He didn't think it through. He didn't stop and consider when they first presented it to him, hey, wait a minute. I know Daniel worships a different God. He's not going to go for this because his 3 buddies wouldn't bow down. I heard about how they wouldn't bow down, and they got thrown in the fiery furnace, and they survived that. He didn't think that far. But now he's thinking about it. Now he's rehashing it. Now he's got a lot of regret. He was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of his day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, verse 15, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. You got to do this, and the law says you got to die the day of. So the day of is coming to an end. They got to execute the punishment for the guy who's guilty. He didn't have a long drawn out court case. He's guilty. He dies that day. He couldn't think of a way, a loophole to get around it. So verse 16 says, So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. So he has a little bit, now listen, we're starting to see that King Darius is being influenced by Daniel's faithfulness. What he knows about Daniel's God has begun to work on him. He has a conscience. His conscience is being assaulted by the truth of the living God. And he says, Daniel, I'm hoping your God that you so faithfully serve, I'm hoping he can rescue you. I've heard about some of these other miracles. Maybe there'll be another one. So this man is on the borderline of faith. Verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and seals of his nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. There could be no question as to whether or not there was any trickery going on. Daniel is clearly in, and they've locked him in. Verse 18, Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. So this man's conscience is under attack. The God of heaven has gone after this man as a result of Daniel's faithfulness. He knows that there's something about this God. And he can't sleep. He can't be entertained like usual. Now notice, he didn't resign his position as king. So his conscience hadn't overtaken him entirely yet. He didn't walk in and say, boys, throw me in the lion's den with him. I'm with Daniel and his God. You notice he didn't go that far. He didn't say, I'm going to stop being king since I can't overturn this law. I'm just going to stop being king. Do with me what you want to do with me. His conscience hadn't reached that point yet, but he's moving. Verse 19, very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. This 60-something-year-old man took off running, they say, to get down there. In verse 20, when he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God. Hey, he described God correctly, didn't he? Oh yeah, he's coming around. Was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? I don't know how long the pause was. It probably might have just been a second or so, but it probably felt like an hour as he heard the echo of his own voice bounce back to him. Verse 21, Daniel answered, long live the king. Good news, king. I still honor you for being king. God has allowed you to be king. So, still going to respect the office that you hold. And I'll say, long live the king. But I need to tell you something more here in verse 22. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. Let me tell you, this is Daniel bragging on himself as much as he possibly can allow himself to brag on his own testimony. Daniel's going to tell him, yes, it was my God. My God sent an angel to do it. Maybe it was the same angel that danced in the fiery furnace. I don't know. They don't tell us, so it doesn't matter. The lions' mouths and their claws are shut down. They don't do him any harm. And oh, by the way, I can tell you the reason that this is true is because God has seen fit to rescue me. God says I'm innocent here. Praying to him instead of praying to you doesn't make me guilty of anything in front of God. I might have broken your law, but your law doesn't have any weight when it comes to God. Amen. And he says, I have not actually done you any wrong either, your majesty. I did not dishonor you in any way, but I most definitely did not dishonor my own God. And so that's it. That's all we know about what happened in the lion's den. Some people question and wonder, and they say, well, were the lions asleep? Did Daniel just hide in a dark corner? Were the lions old and tired and just didn't feel like going after him? All these possible reasons to explain why he could have survived without giving God credit. Don't make the mistake of ignoring God in all this. And I want you to note this as well. Just because God rescued the boys from the fiery furnace and Daniel from the lion's den, that don't mean he's going to save us from everything. Isaiah was faithful to God, and you know what they did to him? They sawed him in half. Paul was faithful to God. You know what they did to him? They chopped his head off in the bright sunshine. Peter was faithful to his dying day, and they crucified him upside down. This isn't some promise that God will always fix it for you. This is a guarantee that God is sovereign over the affairs of man, and when he chooses to step in and provide, even the king and the lions have to bow before God. So let's wrap this up. Verse 23 and following. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted up from the den. So they're going to throw a rope down there, and this nearly 90-year-old man's going to grab hold, and they're going to get him up out of this pit. You know, people weren't supposed to come back up out of it. They didn't really have a strategy, most likely, for getting people out of there. They had a lion's entrance, but they mostly just threw humans in and they didn't come out. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. So that's how God chose to honor Daniel's faithfulness, was to allow him to live a little while longer. If God chooses to allow someone to be martyred, that's God's choice too. Now, verse 24 tells you how strict some of the laws were back then. The king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Now, I don't know if some of the criminals of our day and time would have changed their behavior if they'd known that their wives and their children were going to have to be put to death with them, but I assume this was meant as a deterrent to bad behavior. If you're found guilty, your whole family goes, we're not going to run the risk that your offspring ends up doing what you just did. Wow. But look here, the lions weren't old, they weren't toothless, they weren't bored, they weren't asleep. The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. So now we've got a message in conclusion. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Now, if you've been with us throughout, we've seen this more than once. The king gets his eyes open to the God of Daniel. He declares, this is the good God, the right God. Sometimes it stuck, sometimes it didn't. Most of the time it didn't stick. But here's what King Darius says. This is his testimony, and he sounds like a man who has been converted to faith in God. Peace and prosperity to you, verse 26. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. Verse 27 says he rescues and saves his people. This is Darius's own testimony. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. I would challenge any of our politicians to stand and make that same statement. I would challenge any of our politicians to quote Daniel 6:26 and 27. So the good news here in verse 28, Daniel gets to not only live a while longer, even at his age, pushing 90 years of age. Verse 28, so Daniel prospered. God blessed him even more during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. A lot of translations think that Darius was just a title that was used to describe the king of the Medes, and Cyrus was the actual name of the man because he was a Persian. They think that this is probably the same person. It really doesn't matter. During the time of the Medo-Persians, for the rest of Daniel's life, he holds a position of prominence, and God allows him to be blessed. Why? Because God is doing a mighty work through Daniel, and he is bringing world leaders to faith in God. Nebuchadnezzar has been influenced by Daniel. Now Darius has been influenced by Daniel. And undoubtedly the people of the empire heard word of mouth about Daniel and his God. And so God's people should be people of the highest character. Let me mention quickly, don't try to write all these down, I'm not going to leave it up there long enough. But we've learned through the first 6 chapters, these are just some of the characteristics that ought to be true of God's people. Regardless of our age, regardless of our position in society, we ought to be known as people that are consistent. that when laws change, when leaders change, when empires change, when nations change, we remain consistent. Secondly, we should be people that are obviously focused, who don't get constantly tangled up in the affairs of mankind, because we know that ultimately all the issues in society, all the social issues, all the political issues, none of them can be solved by human ingenuity. And so we should be a people that are focused on the agenda of God. Number three, we ought to be people that are kind-hearted. Daniel always seemed to have a heart, and he was never harsh. He had the right kind of attitude, even with people who mistreated him and worked against him. Number four, he maintained a level of integrity whereby he could be considered mostly blameless, right? They couldn't find anything against him. We ought to strive not so people will think that we're better than them, but we ought to strive to live in a way that is above the fray, with integrity, and keep our name unblemished as much as we can. And we should be loyal workers, loyal citizens, but most of all, loyal to our God. Because even when we do that, we know that there will be envy. People will become jealous. There will be envious actions taken against us. That's number 6. You can count on being envied. You can count on being misjudged. People will misrepresent you. People will misunderstand you. They'll condemn you. Let's make sure they condemn us for the right things. We'll have to be brave when we are aware of the potential consequences. We'll have to stay humble and let God defend us. Now, some of us think we're pretty good at using our mouths to defend ourselves. But we would all learn a good lesson, stay more quiet, be more humble, and let God defend us in His time. And finally, we should strive to be faithful so that other people around us are influenced in the direction of godliness. I can't cause anybody to be saved, and neither can you. But we should strive to be faithful in a manner that would influence them as Daniel and the others that we've read about. They set the earthly example, and then God did the work in the heart of those leaders who came to understand who He really was. Let's pray. Father, I thank You for Your word. Thank You for the opportunity to share it and express it here. May Your name be magnified through all of our efforts today.